This is the story of Duquesne Way, from Back Street to Boulevard, or A Tale of Two Convention Centers. For more than 100 years, beginning in the late 1700s, the Monongahela Wharf was the center of commerce for the burgeoning city of Pittsburgh, while the Allegheny River Wharf was relegated to the role of ugly stepsister, as was the main route along that side of Pittsburgh, Duquesne Way. Both were just places to cross in order to get to where the real places of business and government were taking place. Even today, the Mon side of the city gets the most publicity views, while one hardly ever sees the Allegheny side, though a local news network has recently taken to using the view across the 6th Street Bridge as a backdrop for their news anchors. You can see houses and small businesses located there on some of the older pictures and on these maps around the point. But in 1906, the Pennsylvania Railroad relocated their tracks from the center of Liberty Avenue, which was fast becoming Pittsburgh's main street, to the elevated railway they built along Duquesne Way. The houses disappeared and the warehouses took over the point. Probably the most interesting thing about Fort Duquesne Boulevard is that each end of the roadway has been the host of beautiful, huge convention centers, but about 100 years apart. Two bridges got people to Fort Duquesne Way, the Union Bridge and then later the Manchester Bridge from the north side, and the Point Bridge from the west. The Union Bridge was a covered bridge. In 1885, the nonprofit Pittsburgh Exposition Society leased land along the north shore of the point to build three exposition buildings at a cost of $1 million, a machinery hall built entirely of iron and glass, and then a grand music hall and a main hall, which also included an art gallery. And beginning in the fall of 1889, thousands of people would take excursion trains and steamboats from all over western Pennsylvania, as well as New York, Ohio, and West Virginia, to visit the Pittsburgh Exhibition. The facility had a daily average attendance of 10,000 during the fall months. Visitors were attracted to the automobile, poultry, and trade shows, while others gathered to enjoy the best orchestras and bands in the nation. Victor Herbert and John Philip Sousa both played at the exposition. And meanwhile, fashion shows from New York and Paris attracted the high society women, while free samples of balloons, popcorn, and dairy products captured the attention of ordinary citizens. And finally, a roller coaster and merry-go-round helped lure the children of western Pennsylvania to the facility. But on St. Patrick's Day in 1901, disaster struck as the flying embers from a nearby stable fire caught the complex on fire and destroyed the music hall and main hall. So the society hired Pittsburgh architect Joseph Stilberg to design the replacement buildings. You can still find some of Stilberg's work around Pittsburgh, notably the Eberhard and Ober Brewery, now known as the Penn Brewery, the Troy Hill Fire Station, and the St. Anthony Chapel, also on Troy Hill. So the grand expositions continued for about 15 more years, but for various reasons were attracting fewer and fewer people until it wasn't viable anymore. But interest in ice skating and hockey was growing, and ice time at the Duquesne Gardens in Oakland was hard to come by. So in 1915, chilling pipes were added to the floor of the main hall, creating a huge ice skating rink called the Winter Gardens. But by 1920, that too closed, and the city took over Mechanical Hall for a garage, machine shop, and auto pound. The music hall continued to bring in bands until it was torn down in 1941, and the Iron and Glass Machinery Hall was dismantled in 1942 so the metal could be used for the war effort. The main hall was demolished in 1951 to make way for Point State Park. Now, flooding was always a concern along the boulevard, Duquesne Boulevard throughout the years, as we will see. This is where the buildings stood and what you'd see today. Another sidebar to Duquesne Way, both literally and figuratively, is the old Allegheny River Wharf. Like I said, the Wharf was the commercial hub of the city from the earliest days, but the Allegheny Wharf did its own share of loading and unloading, at least until the arrival of the automobile. Once more and more people started to drive to work, the wharf became a huge parking lot. But when they started planning a downtown bypass to 11th Street and beyond in the 1940s, the Pennsylvania Railroad elevated tracks still dominated Fort Duquesne Boulevard, so the only place left to build a bypass was along the river. Like I said, flooding has always been a problem. The addition of a walking and bicycle trail along the river has proven to be very popular. And that brings us to Fort Duquesne Boulevard itself. coming into downtown Pittsburgh straight off the Point Bridge would send you directly down Duquesne Way past the Exposition buildings on the left and the Pennsylvania Railroad warehouses on the right. But that all disappeared when they began to build Point State Park in the 1950s. But the Point still attracts huge crowds of people for all kinds of events. But that was still a dream in 1955. These pictures are looking upriver into downtown Pittsburgh. These pictures are looking back towards the Point, but this intersection with 3rd Street no longer exists. It's in Point State Park. This is what you'd see from that vantage point now. This intersection, once known as 4th Street, is now Commonwealth Place that separates Point State Park from Gateway Center. This is 4th Street itself, but you might know it as this. These photos are looking upriver along Duquesne Way from 4th Street. And today. Now, if you continue up Duquesne Way, you would pass Evans Way, which looks like this today. Looking towards the Point from that same spot. And upriver from Evans. The next intersection on the way to 6th Street was once known as 5th Street, of course, but we now call it Stanwix Street. It's looking back towards the Point from 5th Street or Stanwix. And upriver. This is the view down Stanwix itself in 1908 and then again in 1915 towards the Joseph Horn department store. These are looking downriver again from Stanwix. And more looking upriver from Stanwix. It's changed quite a bit through the decades. Between Stanwix and 6th Street is another alley known as Cecil Way. This is looking towards 6th Street from Cecil. And back towards the Point from Cecil Way. There's one more alley called Mentor Way before you get to 6th Street. It looks like this now. But now we get to 6th Street, which is on the right headed towards 7th on the left. There have been 4 bridges at 6th Street crossing from the north side to downtown. The first was a covered bridge. This is the second bridge there, designed by John Roebling. Now this is the third bridge. When it was decommissioned in 1927, they lowered it into the river and floated it on barges down to Coraopolis, where it was used to get people back and forth from Neville Island until 1986. The fourth and most recent is one of the 3 sister bridges, along with the 7th and 9th Street bridges, and has been renamed the Clemente Bridge after famous pirate right fielder Roberto Clemente. But in 1901, Henry Phipps, the president of Carnegie Steel, became spectacularly rich by selling his company's shares to J.P. Morgan. And among other things, he built 2 buildings flanking 6th Street as you come off the bridge. The Bessemer building on the left, which opened in 1905, and the Fulton on the right, named after the inventor of the blast furnace and the steamboat. The Bessemer building was torn down in 1964. The iconic Fulton building is now the Renaissance Hotel. This is looking up 6th Street in 1944 and today. Looking towards 7th. Now in 1913, late 1913, a plan was hatched to enclose the lower part of the elevated railway between 6th and 7th Streets and create something of a farmer's market for the city dwellers. It was quite popular for a few years. Phipps had included in the Fulton building a vaudeville palace called the Gaiety, which switched to movies in 1930. The zombie flick Night of the Living Dead had its world premiere at the theater in 1968, and it later became Heaven, Pittsburgh's version of Studio 54, which in the early 80s brought disco balls, glitter cannons, and dancers in cages to the Fulton's stately interior. It lives on today as the Byham Theater. This is looking back towards 6th Avenue in 1966, 6th Street. Now we'll look at Duquesne Way between 7th and 9th. The first 7th Street bridge from Sandusky Street on the north side was designed by Gustav Lindenthal 3 years after he designed the Smithfield Street Bridge. It was replaced by another sister bridge, now known as the Andy Warhol Bridge. This is the view coming off the bridge up 7th Street into downtown Pittsburgh. There was another alley between 7th and 9th called Maddock Place. This is that same view today. Now we get to 9th Street and beyond. This is looking from towards 7th Street from 9th Street. And this is 9th Street as we know it today. But over 100 years ago, they were just starting to put in the streetcar tracks. Same corner with Duquesne Way. And again, looking down Fort Duquesne Boulevard today. This is what it looked like 100 years ago. Looking towards the convention center. And looking back towards 9th Street from the convention center. This is the view from the 9th Street Bridge. This bridge is now known as the Rachel Carson Bridge. This is Garrison Street. And as it looked about 80 years ago. You can see the retaining wall on the right in this next picture. Now, in the 1950s, as plans for Point State Park progressed, the warehouses at the point were torn down, and most of the wholesale commerce had moved to the Strip District, so there was no more need for them. Then there was also no more need for the elevated railway. As we continue down Fort Duquesne Boulevard, it once ended at a warehouse terminal along the river in the Strip District, but that's now a parking lot. These photos are looking back downstream under the Fort Wayne Railroad Bridge and beyond. And this is the same view today. Here's the turn at 10th Street off Fort Duquesne Way. Now Fort Duquesne Boulevard. In the 1970s, the area around 10th and 11th Street was cleared for a new convention center. Work began on it in the late 70s, and it opened to the public in 1981. It was also known as the David L. Lawrence Convention Center, but it was so nondescript that I couldn't find any pictures of the exterior. They tore it down 20 years later to begin work on the new David L. Lawrence Convention Center as we know it today. Opened in 2003, the building was awarded the Gold Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, or LEED certification, by the U.S. Green Building Council, making it the first such convention center in the U.S. and the largest green building in the world. In 2004, it won the Supreme Award for Structural Engineering Excellence from the Institution of Structural Engineers. It hosts thousands of people in a wide variety of events throughout the year. But I guess the more things change, the more things remain the same.